Hello. Not good enough. Let's try again. Over here. Hello. 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 Everybody, hello. This is so exciting. This is amazing. Tonight, in this room, we are going to begin the change of education. Tonight, I want you to remember this date, because here in SAVIA, this evening, you are going to make me a promise. And that promise is that each of you tomorrow will go back into your schools and you will begin the change. You will be here when Spain changes education. Now, because this is such a special moment, I have decided that we are going to take the world's biggest selfie. So what I need is for everybody, please, to stand up. On three, I want everybody to say hello. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. Yes! Sit down. Amazing. Now, I want to explain to you why tonight we need to begin the change for education. And I want to start by asking you a question. How many of you have children of your own at home? Put up your hand if you have children. Yeah, I am so sorry. Me too. I have 2 teenage children at home. It's why I spend my life in Spain. I want to tell you about my 2 children, because my children at home are just like everybody else's children. And I think that our children are amazing. So, first, I'm going to tell you about my son. My son is my younger child. He is 15 years old. Horrible. He smells. Don't tell him I said that. The other day, I wanted to ask him a question. And my son was in his bedroom. And he was playing on his PlayStation. So I went up to his bedroom, which is a dangerous thing for a father to do. Parents sometimes never come out. I went to his bedroom and I stood in the corner while he was playing his game. He was playing on FIFA football and he was concentrating really hard. And he had his headphones on and his microphone. And he was speaking to a friend who he was playing with. But amazingly, my son was speaking in Russian. Now, my son has never learnt Russian at school, ever. But he's playing on this game, talking Russian. So, I wait for him to finish his game. And then I say to him, Andrew, now he is a teenage boy. And teenage boys talk in a certain way. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world, all teenage boys are the same. So I say, Andrew, what? When did you learn to speak Russian? And he looked at me in the way that teenage sons look at their fathers. He said, I have a friend in Moscow. His name is Sergey. And I play FIFA with Sergey. And while we play FIFA, I teach him English and he teaches me Russian. Wow. I have a question. Why would Andrew ever need to go to a traditional school if he is already learning Russian at home with a friend on the other side of the world? This is one reason why schools have to change. And now, let me tell you about my daughter. My daughter. My daughter is 18 years of age. But really, I'm very proud of my daughter. My daughter has just left school, and she has just left home to go to university. And the reason I stand with you today and tell you how proud I am of my daughter is because my daughter has started training to become a teacher. I couldn't be prouder of my daughter. But I have to be honest, I'm glad she's left home. You know, it's one of those moments where you see the difference between a mother and a father. Because on the day that my daughter left home to go to university, my wife is standing by the front door of our house going, oh, goodbye. I'm stood by the front door of our house going, yes! So she goes. Now, before she left for university, before she left school, my wife and I went to her final parent-teacher evening, the meeting where we were talking to her teachers for the last time. And I was looking forward to going to my daughter's last parent-teacher evening because we were going to meet my daughter's hero. Now, until my daughter was 12 years old, I was my daughter's hero. Everything I said to my daughter before she was 13 was so funny. Oh, Daddy, you're so funny. Everything I said to my daughter, she thought I was so clever. I was like a god to my daughter. And then she had her 13th birthday. And on the morning of her 13th birthday, I was no longer a god to my daughter. I was no better than the dirt on her shoe. And she had discovered a new hero, her history teacher. Her history teacher was so funny and so clever. I would say to my daughter, "What did you learn in history at school today?" And she would say to me, "You wouldn't understand." So, we were going to my daughter's last parent-teacher evening, and I was going to meet Mr. History. I couldn't wait to meet Mr. History because I was going to punch him. So we sit down with my daughter's history teacher, my wife and I. And it turns out that my daughter's history teacher loves my daughter as much as she loves him. He started talking to us, and he said, "Oh, your daughter is so clever. She is so grown up." I was sure he was talking about the wrong child. Her essays, the way she writes, she is so mature. She is able to see the world from so many different points of view. She is able to argue all sides of an argument. He said, "I wish that all my students were like your daughter." As he was speaking, I am not very grown up. And as he was speaking, I started to laugh. For my daughter. And my wife did something that she's not done in the 22 years that we've been married to each other. She took my hand and held it gently under the table. Now, because I am a man of a certain age, I didn't understand the signal. And I'm thinking to myself, ooh, it must be my birthday. Let's go home. It was only when the bones in my finger started to break that I understood what she was saying to me. What she was saying was international wife language for shut up. You see, my wife knew why I was laughing. I was laughing because I know how my daughter does her homework. She gets given the question at school. She comes home from school. She goes up to her bedroom. She turns on her computer. Now, my daughter currently has nearly 4,000 friends on social media. So, she goes onto her social media and she types in the title of the question she has to answer. And then she goes downstairs and she makes herself a cup of coffee. 5 minutes later, she goes back to her bedroom and her work has been done for her. Now, the interesting thing is that if I had told my daughter's teacher about how she did her homework, my daughter's teacher would say that my daughter was cheating because she wasn't working in the traditional way. I would argue that my daughter is working in a whole new way. And she is working in a way that the world of the 21st and 22nd century wants from our children. So again, I say to you this evening, why does a child need to study in a traditional school? The world is changing so fast. Whether we like it or not, our children are no longer needing us if what we do is to teach them the way that we were taught. Our children are probably the cleverest generation the world has ever seen. But here's the problem. We know that the education system doesn't work. Everybody knows that the education system doesn't work. But instead of taking a step back and saying maybe we need to think differently about the education system, all we do is we keep looking for the silver bullet. We keep looking for the new answer. We keep waiting for somebody to come along and tell us what to do. And this is really dangerous, because what then happens is we wait and somebody like me comes along and I give you a new idea and I call it a clever name and I put it into complicated language and everybody says, oh, that must be the future. Or a politician comes along and gives us a new system or a new strategy and tells us that this is the answer. But the problem with silver bullets is that they just keep helping us to do the same thing that we have always done. Think about how many new ideas and new policies that you've had to live through in your time as a teacher. How many new ideas and policies people have said to you will solve the problem? And the truth is this: it's not about other people's ideas. It's not about experts like me telling you what to do and how to do it. It's about you trusting your own expertise. It's about you realizing that you are the professionals, that you have great ideas, and you know how to move forwards. You see, the problem with silver bullets is this: they are all designed to reflect how we were educated. Let me explain. This is a fishing village in the north of Scotland. Now, I want you to look carefully at this picture. There is a man just here, and he stood on a van, a car, and the car is sinking. Now, I'm not sure of the truth, but what you can't see is that there is a bar just here out of the photograph. Now, I don't know, but I wonder if the bar and the man on the sinking car have anything in common. Anyway, the car is sinking. Now look carefully, because there are a group of men stood on the side watching the man in the water. And I'm talking to the women in the audience now. Have you noticed that whenever there's a physical problem, men seem to think that they must be in charge? When there's a physical problem, men go back to being cavemen. These men were in the bar, and they would have been stood in the bar with their beer, going, ooh, physical problem, car sinking in water. This is for me to sort out. Little lady, little woman, I go sort problem. You wait here. And the men are standing in what I call man problem-solving position. And they realize that the way to solve the problem is to use the crane. Now, the crane is there because usually it is used to lift the fish from the water. So the men decide, we must use the crane to lift the car from the water. And then we shall go back to the bar and drink beer and celebrate how clever men are. And everything is going brilliantly. Look. Oh, have a look here. Everything is going brilliantly. What I want you to notice about this picture is that now there are even more men stood by the crane, because nothing attracts men to other men more than success. So now there are lots of men, and the men are very excited because the men can't wait to go back to the bar, to drink more beer, to celebrate how clever they are. And they are just about to go back to the bar when this happens. Now, what you need to notice about this picture is that all the men are running away. Even the dog is a boy dog, and he too is running in the other direction. Now, because of the way that we were taught at school, we were taught that if something doesn't work, it's because we weren't trying hard enough. How many times do you hear teachers say to students, you didn't pass your test because you didn't try hard enough? You didn't pass your exam because you didn't spend enough time learning for your exam. You can't answer my question because you didn't listen carefully enough. So from the time we are children, little children, we are told that the reason people fail is because they don't try hard enough. So what happens as we grow up and become teachers is that we think we have to work all the hours of the week to prove that we care. So teachers give up their weekends and we give up our evenings because we feel guilty if we're not working enough hours. This is a tragedy. Because the truth is, if something isn't working, it's not because we don't try hard enough. It's because maybe, just maybe, the system is wrong in the first place. So here is the rest of my sad story. The men come back to the problem. Ooh. Crane didn't work. Now, sadly, because of the way they were educated at school, what they say next is, we didn't use a big enough crane. So they go and get themselves a bigger crane. And all the men have come back now to celebrate their manly genius. The saddest thing about my story is that I don't even need to show you the last picture of my tale. I cannot believe that these men have got themselves a bigger crane, and now they're about to go back to the par because now they think they've solved the problem, because now they've tried harder, and this happens. We have to stop just trying harder. The problem isn't that we're not trying hard enough. The problem is that the plan doesn't work. And the biggest problem with all of this, and not just in education, but in every part of our lives, is that because the world is changing so fast, and we just keep trying to do the same thing over and over again, we're finding that more and more people are suffering from the greatest disease of the 21st century. Now, we all know how dreadful Ebola is. We all know how frightening that disease is. But it isn't the biggest killer in the 21st century. The biggest disease in the 21st century is this: stress. What upsets me about this is too many people in our society believe that stress is just a sign of weakness, that stress and mental health problems only have an effect on people who aren't strong. This is nonsense. Stress happens to people when they no longer think they are in control of their own lives. And the danger with where we're living in the world right now is that the world is changing so fast, we can't keep up. And because we can't keep up, we no longer feel in control. And because we no longer feel in control, we suffer from stress. And here's the really sad part. Not only do we suffer from stress, but the mental health problems among young people are the highest they have ever been in human history. What are we doing to our children? Now, on the next slide, I am going to show you 5 of the main signs of stress-related illness. I'm not going to say very much. I'll read them so that the translator can translate what they are. But while I'm reading them, I want you to think about 3 things. I want you to think about how many of the signs I show you, you suffer from. I want you to think about how many of the signs I show you, your friends and colleagues suffer from. And finally, and most powerfully, I want you to think about how many of the signs I show you, your students suffer from. Here we go. 1, the first sign. People who are getting stressed show anxiety when something new is suggested to them. They step back and become frightened. 2, they become tense in a new situation, a situation they hadn't planned for, something that is a surprise to them. 3, there is a sign that shows that people who are suffering from stress drink more alcohol and take drugs more often. Not illegal drugs, the drugs you can buy from the pharmacy. They self-medicate with alcohol and drugs. 4, they have a tendency to complain when they're asked to be involved in a new experience. And 5, people who are suffering from stress tend to focus on the bad things in their lives rather than the good things in their lives. They're the kinds of people who will say, I never do well. I never get things right. I always make mistakes. I never understand. So think about this. You, your friends and colleagues, and your students. We have to do something about this. We have to change the way that our children are taught to think. Now, I want to tell you at this point about one of my best friends. And the reason I want to tell you about this particular friend is because he's very cool and very famous. And I have found that as I have got older and I have become fatter and I have lost my hair, I need to hang around with young, cool people to feel good. So now I surround myself with young, cool people. And he is my favorite young, cool person. His name is Sébastien Foucault. Sébastien is French, but that's okay. Sébastien is famous because he is the founder of free running or parkour. He was the man that started the movement of people jumping over buildings. He's an amazing man. He's particularly famous because he starred in the James Bond film Casino Royale. How many of you have seen the James Bond film Casino Royale? Put your hands in the air. Do you remember the scene at the beginning where they're chasing over cranes and buildings? That is Sebastian. And let me tell you something amazing about Sebastian. He is scared of heights. Amazing. He's also famous because he designed the dances for Madonna's last world tour. He is very cool, and he's my friend. So, we were doing an event together in Russia, in a city called Ekaterinburg, which is famous because it is the place in Russia where the Tsar and the Tsarina and their children were slaughtered at the end of the Russian Revolution. It is an extraordinary city, rich in history. And it's also an extraordinary city because it's one of those cities in the world where as you walk through the streets and you look at the buildings, you can see the city's history. Because as you walk through the streets, you see the beautiful buildings that were built before communism. Then you see the horrible concrete buildings that were built during communism. And then, now, you see an explosion of incredible new creative buildings that have started to be constructed since communism in Russia ended. It's an extraordinary city. And I was walking through the streets, looking at the buildings like a child at a firework party. I was walking through the streets going, amazing. And we get to the end of our journey, which is the place where the Russian royal family were murdered. And on the space where the Russian family were murdered, they have built a church. And it's got the best name of any church in the world. It's called the Church of the Blood. Fantastic. And this building is stunningly beautiful. So at this point, I just become stupid with excitement. So I'm standing there with Sebastian saying, look at this beautiful building. And from Sebastian, nothing. So I say it again. Sebastian, look at this beautiful building. And he says, what are you talking about? The buildings. I haven't seen the buildings, he said. I said, what have you been looking at? He said, this is the interesting thing about me, Richard. Since I was a child, buildings don't interest me. He said, I see buildings as obstacles. In my mind, buildings only block out the light. He said, since I was a child, I have been fascinated by the spaces between objects, between the buildings. He said, I have always looked at these spaces and thought to myself, how do I use the space to get around the building, or over the building, or under the building? He said, I am fascinated by the spaces. He said, and it's interesting, you know, Richard, because it seems to me that most people in the world are obsessed with the buildings. And as he was talking, I was thinking to myself, you know, this is true. Because this is the way we're educated to think. We're educated to think that this is an obstacle. This is a problem. I can't get round the problem. I can't get over the problem. So most people stop at the problem. Think about the way we talk about education. We say, I would love to do that. I would love to be more creative. I would love to spend more time developing children as people. But then as educators we say, the worst word in the global language, but. I would love to, but. I would love to, but exams. I would love to, but inspectors. I would love to, but the government. I would love to, but the curriculum. We always find a reason why we can't. We are obsessed with the buildings. If we are going to change education, we have to change the way that we think. We have to start looking at the spaces. We have to start looking at the small bits of light. And tiny bit by tiny bit, we have to start finding our way around the obstacles. Because nobody is going to knock the buildings down. If we keep waiting for politicians, it will never happen. Politicians, I'm sorry to say this, on the whole, stupid. Politicians have no idea what they're talking about. We cannot wait for politicians. We need to teach our children to think differently. When we had finished this discussion, Sebastian and I went for a coffee together, and we talked some more. And we came up with a different way of seeing the problem. And it's this. Many people grow up to become rocks. What we do with children, and children are amazing. They're like little stones in a stream. They bob about and they move around and they try all sorts of things. Have you ever wondered why it is that children, little children, are the most creative people in the world? Have you noticed that little children never see problems? Little children only ever see the light. They're always exploring. They're curious. They're always challenging the world. Yet we seem to think that little children need to be educated. Wow. There are experts out there that will tell us that we learn somewhere between 70 and 75% of everything we learn in our lifetime before we are 5 years old. But somehow we believe that when children are 5, we have to teach them how and what to learn. They're extraordinary. Little pebbles in a stream, floating around, traveling down the stream really quickly. And then they start formal education. They come to school. And at school we tell them, don't worry about what you're interested in. I'll tell you what's important. I'll tell you what you have to know. And I'll give you a reward when you do what I tell you to do. So as little children, we stop thinking for ourselves and we wait for somebody to tell us what to do and how to do it. So, formal education comes along, and instead of being little stones that drift down the stream, we find a spot and we sit. And we wait to be made bigger with knowledge and information, so that eventually we move from being a stone and now we're a rock. And the older we become, the bigger rock we become. And we sit and we don't move. Because as adults, We don't work anymore to think about curiosity. As adults, we don't take risks. As adults, we don't question the world. We try and find a spot that we like as adults, and when we've found it, we stay where we are. And we become quite large and quite heavy, and we can't move down the stream anymore. That's how education develops people. However, there will always be some people, like Sebastian, who aren't rocks, they're water. And I love the idea of us teaching children to think like water and not like rocks. You see, the amazing thing with water is that you can't stop it. You can never stop water. You can get in its way, but it will always find a way. It will always keep flowing. It will always keep moving. When it comes across a rock, it flows around it or under it or over it. It never stops. And the real tragedy is that when a rock sits still for long enough, eventually the water will wear it away and the rock becomes nothing. So let's change the way we think, shall we? Let's start teaching our children to think like water and not like rocks. And that means we need to develop a new kind of vision. And in the last few minutes that I have with you, I'm going to share 2 more stories. And then I promise that I will get off the stage and leave you to listen to a proper expert, a great friend of mine and an extraordinary man, Javier Bajon. But before I give the stage to Javier, I am going to tell you 2 stories, okay? The first is about my most famous friend, because I have friends that are more famous than Sebastian. And I met this friend for the first time when I gave a speech in Saudi Arabia a few years ago. I wasn't keen to go, if I'm honest. I wasn't sure that I wanted to go to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia because the theme of the conference was empowerment. And the interesting challenge for me about this invitation was that half the audience would not be allowed in the room with me because they were women. So I had a bit of a problem with the invitation. But in the end, I was persuaded to go because of who the other speaker was. The other speaker is one of my heroes. The other speaker is a man who, in my opinion, has changed the world. So I was going to get to meet my hero, a man who has changed the world. And I was told that because I had agreed to go and give my speech, they would introduce me to my hero and that I would have 5 minutes in a room privately with my hero. Wow. So, for 2 weeks before I go to Saudi Arabia, I start to get really nervous because I'm going to meet my hero. And I do stupid things. And the first stupid thing I do is I decide to practice. Can you believe this? I decide to practice how I should say hello to my hero. So I'm thinking, do I act cool and say, yo? Yo! No. I don't want to be too formal. I don't want to be hello, hello. So I have to practice. And I practice in front of my son. And my son stands there with his mobile phone going, Dad, get a life. You are an idiot. Hashtag. Once I'd practiced my hello and got it perfect, I then decided I had 5 minutes with my hero. And that meant that I was going to get the chance to ask him one question that could change my world. So for 2 weeks, I tried to work out what my question would be. I practiced lots of questions until I came across the perfect question. So then I'm ready, and I go to Riyadh, and I give my speech, and then I'm taken to the door of the room where my hero is. And as I'm about to open the door, I know on the other side of that door is my hero. And I'm thinking to myself, Richard, be calm, be cool, be ready to meet your hero. And my hand goes to the door, and I'm practicing in my head my hello and my question. Because on the other side of the door, my hero is Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple Computers. The man who created the first Apple computers is on the other side of the door. A man who has changed the world. So I'm ready. And I open the door. And I'm thinking, be cool, say hello, ask the question. But as I open the door and see Steve stood in front of me, my world collapses. My brain goes to pieces. And all that comes out of my mouth is, it's Steve Wozniak! People think I've gone mad, completely crazy. Even Steve is looking at me like, who is this lunatic? So I'm thinking to myself, okay, you've blown the hello. Just make sure you ask the right question. So I shake hands. Question. Unfortunately, my brain had gone completely blank. And I can't believe that I'm going to tell you this. But all that came out of my mouth when I was with Steve Wozniak, the man who's changed the world, all that I said was, I can't, true. I said, can I have a selfie? Now, that was made even worse, because as he stood there with me for my selfie, I realized that my phone was a Samsung. Anyway, eventually we got talking about education, and he knows a lot about education, because what the world doesn't know about Steve is that after he left Apple in 1987, he spent time working as a teacher in a local state school. Poof. See, he had plenty to say. And we talked for ages, actually, because I found myself sat next to him on the aeroplane back to London. It was incredible. And I remember one thing he said to me, and I want to share it with you. We had talked about education. We had talked about the future. And we had talked about Apple. And the one thing that I remember more than anything else was when he said to me, you know, Richard, when Steve Jobs and I realized that Apple was going to be a proper company, we went for a beer to talk about the future. And he said, I remember sitting with Steve Jobs in the bar, drinking a beer. And he said, Steve said to me, you know what was? If we're going to make Apple work, we can't be a company that makes stuff. We have to be a company that invents stuff. We have to be a company that always comes on new things. He said, and if we're going to keep making new things and changing the world, we need to employ a different kind of person. You see, it would have been easy for them to employ clever people because Silicon Valley was filled with academically clever people. But that night, they decided on a promise that they made to each other about the kind of person that they would employ at Apple. And he said to me, you know, Richard, the promise must be good because Apple still use it today when they're looking to employ new people. And the promise is this. He said, at Apple, we will never employ anyone who needs managing. Now think about that. We will never employ anyone who needs managing. How do we create an education system that stops training our children to be managed? How do we build an education system where our children are able to manage themselves? And in my opinion, as I finish with my last thought and story, this is the greatest challenge of our lives. It is also the greatest responsibility of what it means to be a teacher. And let me explain why. My final story takes place in China. 7 years ago, I was sent to China by the British government to research the Chinese education system. Now, I was really excited that the British government had chosen me. It was only then that I realized they'd chosen me because they wanted to get rid of me. So I went to China, and I spent a lot of time in traditional Chinese schools. And traditional Chinese schools are very, very scary places. Let me tell you about Chinese schools. At secondary level in Chinese schools, on average, there are 60 to 65 children in every classroom. Children who are considered to be clever have to go to school 6.5 days every week. Children in Chinese schools have up to 5 hours of traditional homework every day. What the PISA league tables doesn't tell us about this wonderful Chinese system, by the way, is that China has the highest level of youth mental health problems in the entire world. So this is how a Chinese lesson works. The teacher walks in. The children stand in silence. They bow to their teacher. They say, "Dear teacher, thank you so much for talking to us today. We hope that we can remember some of what you tell us." You see, in Chinese schools, children aren't allowed to speak. They're not allowed to speak to their teacher, and they're not allowed to speak to other children. For 1 hour after hour after hour, they sit and they listen in silence. At the end of the hour, the teacher stands in front of the children. The children stand up. They bow to their teacher. They say, "Dear teacher, thank you so much for talking to us this morning. We hope we are able to remember some of what you say." It's like thanking your torturer. And then the teacher leaves, and the children go to another class where the same thing happens over and over and over again. I was really by now very, very sad and very, very worried. And then, on my last day, I went to a school in a town 2 hours by aeroplane from Shanghai. It was called Hefei No. 2 School. And I went into a class of 16-year-old children. And as I walked into the classroom, I felt that there was a different atmosphere, because the children were quite excited and they were talking to each other. And then, at that moment, the classroom door opened and the teacher hobbled in. Now, the teacher of these children was 75 years old, and he walked to the front of the classroom. He looked like Yoda from Star Wars. And he stood at the front of the class, and the children didn't stand, but they fell quiet. And then this old teacher bowed to his students, and he said, "Dear students, thank you so much for coming to my lesson today. I hope that some of what we are about to share will be of interest to you." And then he delivered what was, by Chinese standards, a very interactive lesson. The children were talking to the teacher and to each other. At the end of the lesson, he stood at the front of the class again, and the children didn't stand. And again, he bowed to the students, and he said, "Dear students, thank you so much for coming to my lesson today. I hope that you found some of what we talked about interesting." And then he went back to the door, and as he went back to the door, as the children left, he shook each child by the hand and said, "Thank you personally." He had been doing this for 50 years, every lesson, every day. So when I had him on my own, I asked him about his philosophy. And he said, probably for me, the most powerful thing I have ever heard a teacher say about education. I said, "Why do you do this?" He said, "Richard, as I stand in this classroom every day, I look at the faces of the children, and I think to myself, somewhere in my class, one of these faces could be the person who grows up to find the cure to cancer, could be a person who finds the solution to world peace, could be a person that becomes a famous musician, could be a person who becomes a great athlete, could be a person who becomes an amazing doctor, could be a person that becomes an incredible nurse, could be a person who grows up to become a teacher." He said, "But as I look at those faces, I don't know which of those children will go on to become that person and make the world better for all of us. But I know that my job is the greatest job on earth, because how I treat those children, how I teach those children, how I create the feeling in my classroom for those children will possibly help the world find the people who can make our planet better." And let me finish here. That's your classroom. They are your students. And tomorrow, when you go back to your schools and you look into the eyes of your children, remember that somewhere in your classroom could be the person who grows up to change the world. And if we are to find those children in your classrooms, then we have to start to change education now, today. Thank you very much.